Hi all! Today we will focus on getting the app set up. Before we continue, I just want to let you know that I'm doing this course to share with you my enthusiasm and lessons I have learned along the way. Nevertheless, I want this channel to be a source where we all learn from each other. So if you see certain things could be done differently in a more efficient way, please take a bit of your time to leave a comment below so we can all learn. I will be very grateful for that, as I love learning from you just as much as I love sharing with you what I know. I am developing this project week by week, so maybe in the future we will make some changes to the current features we are developing. Another thing I want to mention is that maybe you're wondering, why am I filming this course on the iPad Pro? There are two main reasons why I'm doing that. First of all, is because I consider coding on iPad Pro extremely fun and useful in the same time. If you are a student in the university or you just travel a lot, you can take some notes, design some concepts, and in the same time just attach your Raspberry Pi or connect to the cloud and start coding on your iPad and having fun with it. The second reason is the fun part. I think we can learn much better and we can be more efficient if we have fun. It's a pity to take fun out of learning, because then everything becomes much less efficient and much less productive. Now let's start by checking a bit our previous FigJam schema that I showed you in the last video, so that we can remember how and what we want to achieve. A note here, FigJam has been released for iPad as well, and it's a great app. Like I said in the previous video, it has support for the pencil. You can see here we took some notes last time. That's great. I think it's really nice to use it. You can plan, design, draw, sketch, and in the same time code your project by only using the iPad, nothing else. If you hear a noise in the background, it's my Raspberry Pi. It has a fan. I hope it won't bother you and you can still enjoy going through the video together. As you can see here, as I said, we will develop a photo album. We will create two entities, a folder and a photo. Now let's begin our project. As I mentioned in the previous video, we will use Node.js for the backend to create the APIs, and for the frontend we will use Vue.js. Today we will focus only on setting up the application in the connection with the database using Sequelize, which is an ORM. So fire up your Blink and SSH into the Raspberry Pi. I am already there. I'm gonna list my home folder, and as you can see I have a dev folder here. Let's get into it and let's make a directory called photo album. Let's go inside this directory, and to start a project with Node.js, all we have to do is use npm init. The package name will be photo album indeed. Version, we can leave it 1.0.0. Description, my personal photo album. Entry point, I want it to be server.js. I don't want to use a test command yet. I will decide about that later. A Git repository, you can set one if you want. I'm not gonna do that now because I already have a Git repository where I code all these lessons. So if you check the Git repository that I put in the description below, you'll see that for each lesson I created a branch. So I'm gonna skip that. Some keywords, let's say Node.js, Vue.js, Sequelize, and PostgreSQL. Author name, I'm gonna put my name. The license I want to be MIT. Is this okay? Yes, and that's it. If we list the folder now, we see that we have a package JSON in here. I also want to add a gitignore file, and you can just copy all the contents of my gitignore file from the Git repository once again below in the description. I'm gonna do the same here, so I will skip that part. And now the next step is to start code server and see the project in code server. So I'm gonna use code HTTP localhost 8080, and that will open my instance of code server from my Raspberry Pi inside Blink code. Here I have an old project that I open, so I'm gonna just file, open folder, and I'm gonna open my photo album. Great, and as you can see here, we have the gitignore and we also have the package.json in here. Now let's install some packages that will be useful for us during our development. So I'm gonna say npm install, and I'm gonna install Express, which is a framework which will help us develop APIs easier. I'm gonna install Sequelize, which is an ORM. I'm gonna install pg and pghstore, which are used for Postgres. I also want to install dotenv, and for now I'm gonna say -- save, and that should be it. Now we have to wait for everything to install. Now that we install everything, let's check again in our code server, and in the package.json, as you can see, we have all the plugins that we needed installed. One more thing I would like to install, and that is the Sequelize client that will help me create models and do migrations, and we will talk about migrations a bit later in the video. So I'm gonna say npm install -- save dev, because I want to save this in the development dependencies, and I'm gonna say Sequelize CLI. And one last package I want to install, I'm gonna say npm install -g, because I want to install it everywhere, not only for this project, is nodemon, which will help me start the application, and it will hot deploy. So the moment I make a change in a file, I don't need to stop and start again the server. It will just hot deploy my change, and I'm able to test it like that without restarting. Oh, I think I need to use sudo for that. And now that we have also this installed, we can go back to our code server and start creating our first API. So under the root folder, I'm just gonna create a file called server.js, and the first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna declare express package. So I'm gonna require express. Next thing we need to do is to declare an app, which is basically the constant that will help us create requests. And let's also declare a port here so that we can only change it in one place, not in many places. Let's create this constant. Let's say port 3000 for now, and I'm gonna say app.listen. We will use port, and here we will create a function which will tell us that we have connected to the server. So I'm gonna say here server running on port, and then we will use the $ and curly brackets to call the port. Now we can create our API, so let's create one method. Here we will say app.get, and this will create a get request. If you're not familiar with these types of request, get, post, put, delete, have a look online, Google, and learn a bit about them. But I think by now you should already know these things. So I'm gonna say when I go to the homepage of my application, so that is / I will have a request and a response, and all I want to do is just, I'll say response.send, and just in order to see if this works, I'm gonna put here a paragraph, and in this paragraph I'm gonna say welcome to your photo album. So basically this is it. Now let's try and test our application. So in the folder of our application, we'll do nodemon app, and this should start the app. And as you can see, we are running on port 3000. So now if we go into the browser and we say, we put here http 10.55.0.1, which is the IP of our Raspberry Pi on port 3000, we see welcome to your photo album. I missed an R, but as you can see, we created our first API. Of course, everything will get much more complex after that, but for now, I think we already have set up Express and our Node application is up and running. Another thing I would like to do here is to create specialized routes for each purpose. So let's say we want to create a folder and have operations for the folder. I want to create a folder routes in which I put all the routes related to folders. Same for photos, because if I end up putting here all the routing in one file, I'll get up with a huge messy file. So for that, I will create a folder called routes, and in here I will create a file called folder routes.js. Now in order to make this work, since here we don't have an app that we can call to say app.get or app.post, I'm gonna create also an express variable here. I'm gonna require express, and I'm gonna declare a router, which is part of express.router. And now this works just exactly like with the app. So I'm gonna say here router and folders, because I want to get all the folders, and here I'm gonna declare also a request and a response, just like we did with the server.js. And here I'm gonna say response.send, and once again I'm gonna create here a paragraph, just to test, and in this paragraph I'm gonna say folders. But now, in order to make our application know about this router, we go back to the server.js, and here I'm gonna say app.use folder routes. And in order for my application to know about these folder routes, I'm gonna declare them right here under express. Const folder routes equals require, so I'm going to require our folder routes, which are in the routes folder under folder routes. So now when I go to the IP of my application /folders, one thing we need to do also here in the folder routes, we need to say module exports router so that we can import it back in the server. Now in the server we import folder routes. Oh, sorry, I forgot to put here router.get. And now if we go to the folders endpoint, we see that we get our folders. In order for our folder routes to not have always /folders, what we can do in server.js, we declare a string here which will take the folders path, and for all our folder routes we will use /folders. And now because I added here /folders, I can remove the folders from the folder routes, and basically this is it, because now at this point in time I will use /folders for all the routes in the folder routes. If I would have had here folders as well, then I would have to declare in my browser folders /folders, but because this is not what we want, we leave here / and this should work. Let's say here again /folders. When I go, it works. If I go back to the home page, that one works too, and once again to folders, and they work. So now that we set up our routes for folders and we have our server.js, let's proceed and use Sequelize to connect to the database. And for this we will use Sequelize client. Let's stop our app for a bit. And to use our Sequelize client, the first thing we need to do is to run npx Sequelize client init. And what this will do, you will see it will create a folder structure that will help us work with Sequelize. Now in code server, if you see, we have some folders created. We have a config.json here, we have a migrations folder, and I will show you how we can use that. We have our models where we will declare our database models that we will work with in our code, and we have the seeders, and here in the seeders you can put some test data that when the application starts you can inject that data into the database. Now in the configuration.json, as you can see, we have development, test and production. I'm gonna comment test and production, we will just use development for now. And even more than that, I don't want to have config.json because I want to use environment variables. So in order to do that, I will have to do some modifications. First thing is, in the root of my application I want to create a file called .sequelize.rc. In this file I'm gonna create a constant called path, which will require path module, which I will have to install. And under here I'm gonna say module.exports, and I'm gonna say for the config I want to use path.resolve, and for config I want to use config.js instead. And here we can rename this file here to config.js. Now in our config.js, what I want to do is first of all require dotenv config. What that does is it will allow us to create a .env file in the root of our application, in which we can put environment variables that will be used for testing our application. Of course, we will never commit this file, so in your gitignore, if you pasted my own gitignore, you'll see that here .env file is put to ignore, so we will not commit this, so you don't have your password on Git. Pay very close attention to that. It will be just used for development. When you will deploy this in production, you'll have to set up the environment variables there. Before we continue to develop the config.js, let's also install npm install -- save path. Now here in the config file I'm gonna say module exports, and that will equal to basically our JSON. I'm gonna comment out, as I said, the test and production because I don't need that. And for the username and for the password I'm gonna use environment variables. So here I'm gonna say process.env, this is how we call our environment variables, database _ username, and I'm gonna do the exact same for the password. In the root folder I'm gonna create a .env file where I'm gonna create a database username, which will be Postgres, and a database password, which will be your password, no matter what that is. So one more thing we need to do. For the database name, I called it photo album. You can call it any way you want in Postgres. We will do that together in a moment. And for the dialect, we need to modify it to Postgres. Now, one thing we need to do is I have Postgres installed on the Raspberry Pi. So here we have to put the address of the Raspberry Pi, which should be 105501, and should be the same for you if you followed my video how to install a Raspberry Pi with your iPad. And I guess this is it. Now let's see how to create our database. Now, in order to connect to our database, what we need to do is to run PSQL, and here what we will have to do is create database, and as I said, it will be called photo album. Then we exit or /q, and our database should be created. Now we need to connect to our database. So in the TablePlus application that I'm using on the iPad, I'm gonna create a new PostgreSQL connection. The connection name will be the name of my database. Let's call it photo album. You can also call it however you want. This doesn't really matter. The database host is 105501. The port is 5432. For the database user, we put Pi. For the password, we put the password for your Pi user, and the database name we put photo_album. We test our connection. So the idea is that even if we used capital letters, apparently PostgreSQL convert them to lowercase letters. So the database is photo_album. We tested it work, so we can save it. Now if we come into the database, we see it's empty. No tables, no functions, nothing is there for now. Two things we need to change now. For the database, we're gonna put lowercase letters, and for the user, we're gonna put Pi. And the config should work. Now let's create our first model. In order to do that, I will use the Sequelize client. I can also do everything right here in my application, but I prefer to use Sequelize client for that because you will see it will also generate our migrations. And this is something we will need for production environment. So here in my project directory, I'm gonna run npx Sequelize CLI model generate -- name, and that is the name of the table. In our case, we're gonna call it folder, and I'm gonna say -- attributes. And here in the attributes, I will add the name, which will be string, which is the name of the folder, the parent, which will be the parent of our folder. Let's say for now integer, we will change it in a moment. Creation date, actually no, creation date I don't need because you will see that Sequelize will add it by itself. And I just want to put some notes in here, which will also be string. And basically this is it. We press enter. I think the problem is that we added some spaces here, and probably we shouldn't add spaces. Yeah, now the model was created. Now if we go in our code, we will see that under migrations we have the creation of the folder with all the fields with ID, which was added by Sequelize. Then we have the name, the parent, the nodes. Created that and updated that. As I said, these are created by Sequelize. And we will see immediately how to use this migration, and the object that we will work with will be this folder.js, which, as you can see here, it's also created by Sequelize. But if we're gonna look in our database now, we will see that even if we refresh, we still don't have any tables. Why? Because we need to run our migration. And in order to not have these commands memorized, we will create these commands in the package.json. So here in the package.json, I want to add under scripts, first script which will be database migrate, and here I'm gonna add the command which will be npx Sequelize client database migrate. I also want to add a database migrate undo, and this will undo our last migration. And the last command is to undo all migrations. So I'm gonna say db migrate undo all, and the command is just like undo, only that after undo we have column all. And now, in order to create our tables in the database based on the folder that we have here, all we have to do is to run the migration by running npm run db migrate. So back to the folder of our application, we will say npm run database migrate. We made a mistake in the code. So what we need to do in the config, the dialect is Postgres, only that the database username should be changed. And for that, I'm gonna go into the environment variables and I'm gonna put by here. Don't forget to put your password. Now let's go back to the command line and run the migration. npm run database migrate. And the table should be created. Let's see if we have it. In the TablePlus, we refresh our connection and guess what? We have two tables. The Sequelize meta is to keep count of all the migrations. Don't mind that table. But if we see here, we have the folders table with ID, name, parent, nodes, created that, updated that. I will change this. I want my table to be called folder and not with capital letters, but with lowercase letters, but that we will do it in the next video. For the purpose of this video, all I wanted to show you is how to set up your application and also how to set up the database in order to have a connection running between your project and your database using Sequelize. I also wanted to cover a bit migrations, which is, like I said, an important chapter, especially for when you will work in production. We could have done without migrations for the development, but I want to start clean and start with a project that can be used in production already. That's why we will use migrations when it comes to table creation, table changes, and all the other good stuff. In the next video, we will start to create our API. We will work a bit more on the folders model, and then finally we will create all the API methods needed to interact with our folders table. I really hope that you found this video informative and you enjoyed this episode about setting up a Node.js application and setting up a database connection using Sequelize and PostgreSQL using only our iPad Pro and Raspberry Pi. If you did, or if you have any suggestions, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Don't forget to like this video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm so that more people can benefit from this course. Also, please don't forget to subscribe and press the bell button to receive notifications when the next episode of the series will be released. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.